In today's episode, we travel across the continent to Japan, a city where modernity and tradition coexist in a delicate balance, Osaka. Known for its vibrant culture, stunning landmarks, and dynamic urban life, Osaka stands as a testament to Japan's seamless blending of the old with the new. But beyond the glittering skyline and historical monuments, the city holds deeper, untold stories, ones that reveal the complex layers of human existence beneath its surface. Osaka, Japan, often overshadowed by the grandeur of Tokyo and the historic charm of Kyoto, is a city in its own right, a place where energy pulses through the streets, yet tranquility can be found in the quiet corners. Life in Osaka unfolds like a perfectly orchestrated symphony, with its people moving in harmony, each playing their part in the bustling rhythm of the city. Picture Dotonbori, the neon heart of Osaka, a district that bursts into life as the sun sets. The streets are lined with vibrant billboards, each vying for attention with their bright lights and animated displays. The iconic Glyco Running Man stands tall, an ever-present symbol of the city's vibrant nightlife. The aroma of sizzling takoyaki, octopus-filled street snacks, fills the air, while the hum of laughter, conversation, and excitement carries through the crowd. Locals and tourists alike stroll along the canal, their reflections shimmering on the water as boats glide through, illuminating the surface with their festive lights. But Osaka's pulse doesn't beat only in the crowded streets of Dotonbori. It slows down in places like the Osaka Castle, a relic of Japan's feudal past. Surrounded by lush green gardens, the castle towers majestically over the city, its golden accents gleaming in the sunlight. The park surrounding it offers a stark contrast to the lively urban sprawl, a place where people come to escape, to breathe, and to reflect. In the spring, the castle is a backdrop to an ocean of cherry blossoms, a soft pink blanket that transforms the landscape into something ethereal. Visitors pause to admire the flowers, families gather under the trees for picnics, and the frenetic pace of the city feels like a distant memory. Osaka is a city of neighborhoods, each offering a unique flavor of life. In Shinseki, the old New World district, the streets are lined with retro charm. Towering above is Tsutunkaku, the tower reaching heaven, a symbol of the city's Showa-era optimism. Here you can find locals gathering in traditional bathhouses, elderly men playing shogi, Japanese chess, in the parks, and old-style eateries where chefs prepare kushikatsu, skewers of battered and fried delights. It's a place where time seems to have slowed, holding on to the nostalgia of Japan's mid-20th century. Then there's Namba, the city's southern entertainment hub. Life in Namba feels fast-paced and electric, from high-end department stores to tiny izakayas, tucked into side streets. There's a palpable energy that permeates every alleyway. The sounds of pachinko machines clatter in the background, blending with the constant chatter of diners enjoying a late-night meal. It's a district that never sleeps, where the old temples like Hozenji Temple stand quietly amid the noise, offering a sanctuary for those seeking peace in the middle of chaos. Despite the buzzing energy of places like Dotonbori and Namba, Osaka is also a city of profound quiet and reflection. The Sumiyoshi Taisha Shrine, one of the oldest Shinto shrines in Japan, sits just outside the city center. Here, beneath towering torii gates and sprawling trees, life slows to a crawl. The shrine is a place of worship, a haven where visitors bow their heads in prayer, offering thanks or seeking guidance from the spirits. The crisp sound of footsteps on gravel paths is the only noise, as the busy streets of Osaka feel a world away. Life in Osaka flows like a river, moving through modern skyscrapers, ancient temples, and quiet parks, creating a rich and multifaceted city. At night, the skyline of the Umeda Sky Building glows, its futuristic architecture a reminder of Osaka's status as an economic powerhouse. But it's also a city where tradition still holds strong. The locals, warm, down-to-earth, and proud of their city's rich culinary and cultural heritage, embody the spirit of Osaka itself, a place of resilience, balance, and an ever-present sense of community. Yet, beneath the lively street markets, historic landmarks, and towering buildings, Osaka, like any great city, has its hidden struggles. For many families, the picture-perfect beauty of cherry blossoms and neon lights hides darker, untold stories. Stories of hardship, of loss, and of human endurance pushed to its limits. And while Osaka is known for its strength and adaptability, it is also a city where, for some, The weight of life's burdens becomes too much to bear. In today's episode, we delve into one such untold story. A story that unfolded in the heart of this city in 2017. A story about a family, about a father who loved his son deeply, but whose love became entangled in the heavy burden of caregiving. What happens when love turns into desperation, when the pressure of caring for a child with a debilitating disease becomes an unbearable weight? Today, we explore a tragic case that shook the quiet streets of Osaka and left a community questioning how things could go so terribly wrong. Stay with us as we uncover the heartbreaking case of Shunichi Tanaka, a case that reminds us that even in the most vibrant cities, human endurance has its limits. Shunichi Tanaka lived a simple yet profoundly challenging life in Osaka, Japan. Behind the bustling energy of the city's neon-lit streets and the fast pace of urban life, Shunichi's personal world moved to a much slower, heavier rhythm. His life was defined not by the thriving city around him, but by the struggles he faced every day in his home. The true battle he fought wasn't at work or out in the world, it was within the walls of his house, where he cared for his son, Kenta. Kenta had been diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a devastating genetic disorder that targets muscle function, gradually stripping a person of their strength and mobility. The condition is cruel, especially for children, as it begins to take hold early in life. Kenta had been a lively boy, full of energy and excitement, but as the disease progressed, it began to take away everything. By the age of 10, Kenta was bound to a wheelchair, unable to walk, and his muscles continued to deteriorate rapidly. Every movement became a laborious effort, and as the years passed, Kenta lost the ability to perform even the most basic tasks. For Shunichi, the father-son bond became centered around caregiving. Kenta's condition meant that Shunichi's life revolved entirely around his son's needs. The mornings were filled with the same routine, helping Kenta out of bed, guiding him to his wheelchair, feeding him and assisting him in whatever ways he needed. There were no carefree weekends at the park, no after-school activities to look forward to. Instead, every day brought new challenges, new difficulties, as Kenta's condition worsened and the care he required grew more demanding. As Kenta's health declined, so did Shunichi's emotional and physical well-being. He had once been a man full of life, known for his kindness and tireless work ethic. But as the years passed, those who knew him noticed the changes, the exhaustion etched onto his face, the way his shoulders slumped under the invisible weight he carried. Sleepless nights became the norm for Shunichi. Caring for Kenta was a full-time job, and there were no breaks. The machines that kept Kenta alive, ventilators to help him breathe, medical equipment that assisted his weakened body, hummed continuously, a constant reminder that every moment required vigilance. Shunichi's wife had once shared the burden with him, but as Kenta's illness became more overwhelming, she found herself unable to cope with the stress. The constant care, the emotional toll of watching their son's health decline, and the financial strain on the family drove her to make the heartbreaking decision to leave. Shunichi never blamed her for her departure, but the impact was profound. Left to care for Kenta on his own, he found himself isolated, with no one to turn to for support. As a single father, Shunichi's sense of responsibility deepened. With his wife gone, he became Kenta's sole caregiver, filling the roles of mother, father, nurse, and provider all at once. There were no breaks, no opportunities to take time for himself. The life he had once known, filled with the promise of family and companionship, slowly faded into a reality dominated by caregiving. The sound of Kenta's machines became the soundtrack to their lives, the once cheerful home now marked by the cold sterility of medical equipment. It wasn't just the physical strain that weighed heavily on Shunichi, it was the emotional toll that truly pushed him to the edge. Watching his son suffer day in, day out, unable to enjoy the things that other children did, was unbearable. Kenta could no longer attend school regularly, and his interactions with others became limited to medical staff and his father. There were no friends coming over to play, no family gatherings filled with laughter. Life became smaller and smaller for the Tanaka family, with Shunichi and Kenta confined to the walls of their home. Financial pressures added to the overwhelming burden. Shunichi had to juggle his responsibilities as Kenta's caregiver with the need to work and provide for his son. The medical bills continued to stack up, specialized equipment, hospital visits, and treatments that, while necessary, drained their resources. At times, Shunichi struggled just to keep the lights on and food on the table. He applied for government assistance, but the services available were limited and often failed to meet their needs. Kenta, despite his condition, remained a bright spot in Shunichi's life. He was a kind boy with a gentle spirit, and even as his illness progressed, he did his best to stay positive. But as the disease took its toll, even Kenta's optimism began to fade. The weight of being trapped in a body that no longer worked the way it should was too much for a young boy to bear. And there were days when Kenta felt helpless, a prisoner in his own body. As Kenta's health deteriorated further, Shunichi's life became an endless cycle of caregiving. His exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He loved his son with all his heart, but the daily grind of caring for him without any help began to take a toll on Shunichi's mental health. He rarely slept, consumed by worry and guilt. What if something happened to Kenta while he was asleep? What if he wasn't there to catch it in time? These questions plagued him constantly. Over time, the Tanaka home, once filled with love and laughter, now echoed with only the sound of Kenta's machines and Shunichi's tired footsteps. The weight of the world had settled firmly on Shunichi's shoulders, and no one seemed to notice. The isolation, the financial strain, and the unrelenting caregiving began to hollow him out. The person he had once been, a man full of life and hope, was slowly disappearing, replaced by a father who was desperately trying to keep it all together. As the years wore on, Shunichi's exhaustion turned into something deeper, something darker. He had given everything for his son, and still Kenta's condition continued to worsen. The sense of helplessness grew, suffocating Shunichi as he watched the light in his son's eyes fade just a little more each day. He was trapped, with no way out, and the weight of it all was slowly breaking him. Little did anyone know, this once loving father was approaching a breaking point, and soon the world would come to know the full extent of Shunichi's despair. For those unfamiliar with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, it's a condition that weakens muscles over time, stripping away the independence of those affected. By the time Kenta was 14, he had completely lost the ability to walk and was totally dependent on his father for every aspect of care: feeding, bathing, and dressing. Every day was a challenge. Kenta's muscles were deteriorating, and as his body weakened, his future became uncertain. The disease had no cure, and Kenta's condition was only getting worse. The medical bills were mounting, and Shunichi was drowning in a sea of responsibilities, working to provide, caring for his son, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. But the weight of Kenta's care was slowly crushing Shunichi's spirit. Osaka's vibrant streets felt far away from the quiet desperation inside the Tanaka household. The bustling city, filled with opportunity and excitement, offered no solace to a man who was losing hope piece by piece. It was a typical day in March 2017, or at least it seemed that way to the rest of the world. The city of Osaka hummed with its usual energy, the streets filled with the rush of people going about their daily lives. In the heart of this busy city, life continued as always. Shops opened their doors, commuters hurried to their trains, and children laughed as they made their way to school. But for Shunichi Tanaka, this day was anything but ordinary. In fact, it would be the day that everything changed forever. Shunichi had been Kenta's sole caregiver for years, a role that had gradually consumed him. The once energetic and hopeful man was now a shadow of his former self. The weight of caring for his son, who had been diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally. Day after day, night after sleepless night, Shunichi had watched his son's condition deteriorate. He had done everything within his power to ease Kenta's suffering, feeding him, bathing him, turning him in bed to avoid sores, and monitoring his every breath. But the disease was relentless, and no matter what Shunichi did, Kenta's health continued to deteriorate. On this particular morning, the air in the Tanaka home felt heavy, almost stifling. The same routine unfolded as it always did. Shunichi carefully helped Kenta from his bed, dressed him, and prepared a small meal for him. Kenta, as always, was quiet, his energy drained from the ongoing battle his body waged against his disease. The machines surrounding him, the ventilator that helped him breathe, the monitors that tracked his weakening heart, were the only sounds in the room, a constant reminder of Kenta's fragile state. For years, Shunichi had kept going, powered by her father's love and a sense of duty. But today, something felt different. The exhaustion was deeper, the silence more oppressive. Shunichi's mind was clouded by a storm of emotions: depression, guilt, fear, and above all, helplessness. Depression had crept into his life like an unwelcome visitor, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was the emotional burden of watching his son suffer, knowing that there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had begged for help, applied for assistance from the government, reached out to medical professionals, but the services in Japan were woefully inadequate. What little support he had been able to secure wasn't enough to meet Kenta's growing needs, and the burden of caregiving fell entirely on his shoulders. Shunichi had no family to lean on, no friends to offer comfort. His wife had left years earlier, unable to cope with the pressures of raising a child with such a severe illness. He was completely alone, and the world around him seemed indifferent to his pain. As the days blurred into one another, Shunichi began to feel as though he were drowning, the weight of his responsibilities pulling him under, with no lifeline in sight. That morning, as Shunichi moved through the motions of caring for Kenta, a dark thought began to take shape in his mind. He had always been able to push these thoughts aside, bury them deep within him where they couldn't hurt anyone. But today, they were impossible to ignore. Kenta's face, pale and gaunt, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, was more than Shunichi could bear. His son, the child he loved more than anything in the world, was suffering. Every day, every hour, Kenta endured pain and limitations no child should have to face. Shunichi had always believed that there was a chance things would get better, that the doctors would find a way to ease Kenta's condition, but that hope had long since faded. Now all Shunichi could see was Kenta's inevitable decline, his world growing smaller with each passing day. He knew where this road ended, with Kenta unable to move, unable to breathe on his own, his life reduced to nothing more than machines and medical interventions. And as much as Shunichi hated the thought, he realized he could no longer bear to watch it happen. At that moment, something inside Shunichi broke. He stood by Kenta's bed, looking down at his son, who was too weak to lift his head, too tired to speak. In Shunichi's mind, a twisted logic began to form. This was no longer about giving up. It was about mercy. His son's life had become an unrelenting cycle of suffering, and no matter how much Shunichi loved him, no amount of care or effort could change that. Kenta's future held nothing but more pain, more helplessness, more sorrow. Shunichi's hand trembled as he reached for the pillow on Kenta's bed. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it roaring in his ears. He told himself that this was the only way, that by ending his son's suffering now, he was saving him from a life of endless misery. The guilt that had been eating away at him for years suddenly morphed into justification, the idea that this was an act of love, the final act of a father who couldn't bear to watch his child suffer any longer. With tears streaming down his face, Shunichi gently pressed the pillow over Kenta's face. His hands shook as he held it there, his body numb with a mixture of dread and resolve. Kenta's small, fragile body struggled beneath the pillows, his shallow breaths becoming more labored until finally they stopped. The room was silent. Shunichi stood there, frozen, his hands still gripping the pillow as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. He stared down at his son's lifeless form, waiting for something, relief, release, or something to tell him that what he had done was right. But instead, a deep, hollow emptiness settled into his chest. He had ended Kenta's suffering, but in doing so, he had crossed a line that could never be undone. Love, twisted by years of caregiving, by the unbearable burden of watching his son waste away, had led him to commit the unthinkable. In the moments that followed, a chilling silence filled the Tanaka home. The machines that had kept Kenta alive, the rhythmic beeping and whirring, were now pointless. Shunichi's world had stopped, just as his son's had. Relief mingled with horror as the gravity of what he had done sank in. His hands, still clutching the pillow, began to tremble uncontrollably. He had believed he was saving his son, but the stark reality was that he had become something he had never imagined: a murderer. Shunichi collapsed onto the floor beside Kenta's bed, tears pouring from his eyes as the full weight of his actions bore down on him. There would be no going back, no undoing what he had done. He had silenced his son's suffering, but at the cost of his own soul. As Shunichi sat there, the world outside continued on, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded inside the Tanaka home. The busy streets of Osaka moved with their usual rhythm, but inside that quiet room, Shunichi's life had come to an abrupt, tragic end. After the horrific act, Shunichi tried to take his own life. He swallowed a handful of pills, intending to end his own suffering just as he had ended his son's. But fate, in its cruel way, kept him alive. He woke up hours later, disorientated and consumed by the enormity of his actions. When the police arrived at the scene, it was Shunichi himself who called them. His voice was hollow and emotionless as he confessed to the crime. There was no attempt to flee or deny what had happened. Instead, he simply waited for the authorities, sitting by his son's lifeless body. The quiet streets of Osaka would soon be filled with the whispers of neighbors and the echo of police sirens. The once private pain of the Tanaka household was now a public tragedy. The police quickly opened an investigation into Kenta's death, but there were no secrets to uncover. Shunichi's confession was straightforward. He told the officers everything, that he had killed Kenta because he could no longer bear to see him suffer. In his mind, it was an act of mercy, but the law saw it differently. As the investigation continued, details of Shunichi's life began to emerge. Friends and neighbors described him as a devoted father who had sacrificed everything for his son. But behind closed doors, the story was more complicated. Shunichi had become overwhelmed by depression, isolation, and the relentless burden of caring for Kenta without any meaningful support. It wasn't long before the community learned of the tragic circumstances leading up to Kenta's death. The story shocked Osaka, a city where the issue of caregiver burnout is often ignored, yet painfully familiar to many. The trial of Shunichi Tanaka was difficult for everyone involved. The prosecution portrayed Shunichi as a man who had committed an unforgivable act. They acknowledged the difficulty of his situation, but argued that Kenta's life was valuable, no matter the challenges he faced. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They described a man who had been driven to the edge by the unbearable weight of caring for a terminally ill child without any help. They argued that Shunichi had not acted out of malice, but out of desperation. They emphasized that Japan's inadequate mental health and social services failed both Shunichi and Kenta, leading to the tragic outcome. Witnesses testified to Shunichi's dedication to his son, detailing the endless hours he spent caring for Kenta, often at the expense of his own well-being. But the prosecution reminded the court the law could not excuse murder, no matter the circumstances. Shunichi's emotional breakdown during the trial was a pivotal moment. As he spoke about the years of sleepless nights, the mounting medical bills, and the anguish of watching his son slowly fade away, it became clear that he was a man broken by the weight of his responsibilities. In the end, the court sentenced Shunichi to 12 years in prison for manslaughter. While the court acknowledged his deteriorating mental state and the overwhelming burden he faced, they ultimately ruled that Kenta's life had been taken unjustly. For many, the case raised important questions about Japan's treatment of caregivers and its failure to support families caring for children with disabilities. The sentence, 12 years for manslaughter, was seen as a compromise. While the court could not ignore the gravity of the crime, it also could not overlook the immense burden Shunichi had carried for years without help. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as Shunichi was led away in handcuffs. The man who had once been a devoted father was now a convicted criminal. Yet, for those who knew him, this wasn't just the story of a murder, it was the story of a system that had failed a family, pushing a father beyond the breaking point. This case wasn't just about one man's tragic decision, it shone a light on a much larger issue: caregiver burnout, especially in Japan, where social expectations often pressure families to bear the burden of care in silence. There are thousands of families like the Tanakas across Japan, struggling to care for loved ones with little to no support. In Japanese society, there's a cultural expectations that families should take care of their own, often in isolation. This belief has left many parents, spouses, and children drowning under the weight of caregiving responsibilities, with few resources available to help them manage the physical and emotional toll. Japan's rapidly aging population and lack of adequate healthcare services mean that the Tanaka family's struggle is not unique. Across the country, there are countless caregivers who are left to fend for themselves, silently shouldering the immense emotional and financial burdens that come with caring for someone who is chronically ill or disabled. The Tanaka case, though tragic, forced many in Japan to ask, how many other caregivers are on the verge of breaking? How many other families are suffering in silence, just like Shunichi and Kenta did? In Japan, there is an unspoken expectation that families will bear the full responsibility of caregiving. It is considered a private matter, something to be managed behind closed doors. Asking for help is often seen as a sign of weakness or failure, and as a result, many families are left to cope with the overwhelming burden on their own. The cultural expectation was especially true for Shunichi. He never sought help, partly because he believed it was his duty to care for Kenta on his own. The stigma surrounding mental health in Japan also played a role. Shunichi was struggling, but there was no one to turn to. Even if he had reached out, the available services were minimal, and the societal pressures to keep it within the family likely discouraged him from seeking support. Japan's healthcare system offers some support for elderly care, but resources for parents caring for disabled or chronically ill children are limited. The lack of accessible mental health services compounds this issue, leaving many caregivers feeling isolated and overwhelmed. In the end, the tragedy of the Tanaka family is one of love, sacrifice, and ultimately the limits of human endurance. Shunichi Tanaka was a father who loved his son deeply, so deeply that, in his distorted mental state, he believed that ending his son's life was the only way to protect him from further suffering. But as we reflect on this heartbreaking case, we must also look at the broader picture. The Tanaka case serves as a wake-up call for governments, healthcare systems, and societies to address the silent struggles of caregivers. Mental health support, respite care, and community outreach programs must become priorities if we are to prevent more families from reaching the breaking point. In Kenta's memory, let us remember that no caregiver should ever feel alone, and no family should ever be left without the support they need to navigate the challenges of chronic illness or disability. If you found this story compelling, be sure to check out our other videos where we dive into similarly haunting and tragic cases that explore the darkest corners of the human experience. From untold family tragedies to murder mysteries that shock entire communities, we uncover the truth behind the headlines. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Stay tuned for more stories that will leave you questioning how well we truly understand the people around us.